The Supreme Court gave a big hint as to what they're going to do in the Colorado disqualification case today. And let's talk about why I think they gave a hint as to what they're looking at. Let's talk first, how does the Supreme Court work? I'm no expert of Supreme Court jurisprudence. I have actually been to the Supreme Court. I've never appeared before them, but I am admitted in the Supreme Court. Mostly it's a ceremonial admission, but I am. But the way the Supreme Court works is typically there's only questions of law that they consider, questions of fact, and the fact finding is for the lower court to develop and to find. Okay, so think about it. The lower court, the trial level court, is where the facts come out. And the facts come out through either witness testimony or evidence that is presented, and either the jury as the finder of fact, or sometimes a judge can be the finder of fact, especially if it's a bench trial. And that's how it works. And the judge is sort of the referee, where they decide what is relevant evidence and what is admissible evidence. And so they will help develop the record where allegedly, where only appropriate and relevant admissible evidence comes in. And they are supposed to keep out prejudicial, inappropriate, hearsay, and other evidence that's not permitted to come in. And that's why the rules of evidence are so important. But the facts are what they are, and the record is what it is. And you're not allowed to expand on the record when you appeal. You're not allowed to expand with more evidence or different evidence. Of course, there are exceptions, but this is typically how it works. And the appellate court, typically, they basically accept the facts and the findings of facts, and they see whether the judge interpreted the law correctly, and they apply the law to the facts correctly. And so what exactly is the Supreme Court doing? And the what is strange, okay, and so the Supreme Court could take years. Okay, by the time someone is convicted, like say, if we're talking a criminal case or a civil case, it doesn't really matter. By the time there's a finding in the lower court, it gets appealed to the middle appellate court, and then to the Supreme Court. It can take like 7 years between the time of the lower court, or from the time that the case was initially filed to the time the Supreme Court decides, because there is so much and so slow, so much stuff that happens, whether it's filing briefs or looking at or ordering the minutes so that you have the record that you can rely upon, or whether it is, like I said, appealing in the middle appellate court, or then obviously going to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court only takes a tiny fraction of cases that happen around the country, and a tinier fraction of cases where people request that the Supreme Court take the case. They don't take most cases. And so what you do is you petition the court with a petition for certiorari, which is a Latin phrase that basically means you're asking the Supreme Court to take the case. And the way you do it is you have to petition them, and then if they accept it, they usually tell you, these are the issues that we're considering. This is the legal issue we intend to decide. They don't typically decide all of the legal issues, right? There's so many issues and so many things that a lower court will have decisions that they make, right? Whether certain evidence is admissible, whether there was enough evidence, whether the jury instructions were accurate, whatever it is. There's a million legal questions that lower courts will decide in any one case. But the Supreme Court will tell you, typically, of all of those, these are the ones we are going to decide. And what's strange about the Colorado case, the Colorado Supreme Court case, is that the Supreme Court didn't really clarify what they were going to talk about, or what issues they wanted briefed and what they're going to decide. And George Conway, who is a conservative commentator, and he's very vocally against Trump, even though he's a Republican, he wrote an article in The Atlantic that I read that I thought was very interesting, because what he was saying was, first of all, it's strange how quick. It's not strange in a bad way, but it's unusual how quickly the Supreme Court is handling this. So this doesn't typically happen. And it just goes to show how important they think this Colorado disqualification case is, because Colorado and Maine have both decided that Trump is disqualified from being on the ballot based on the 14th Amendment, Section 3 insurrection clause. And so that is the case that's there, just the Colorado one. What George Conway said was, it's unusual for the court to agree to review the case without specifying what the legal issues it intends to decide are, because oftentimes they do specify. And also interesting was, once Trump was taken off the ballot in Colorado because he lost that case, actually, the case had to do with the Colorado Republican Party was the party that was involved in that litigation. They're the ones who petitioned the Supreme Court to take their case, and Trump later petitioned the Supreme Court to take his case. The Supreme Court didn't rule on the Colorado Republican Party's petition, only on Donald Trump's. And what George Conway said is odd, is that usually they don't just take the entire case and all the issues because of just the way they work and volume, et cetera. But here, what they did was they left it very vague. And again, typically, the way they do it is the Colorado Republicans, their petition to the Supreme Court had 3 discrete questions of law, because the way it works with the Supreme Court is the questions presented in your writ of certiorari or your petition for certiorari. There's a Supreme Court rule that says it has to be short, concise, and you have to really kind of work on your questions of law, and that's a really important part of your brief and a part of your petition. And so what did they do? The Colorado Republican Party, they had 3 discrete questions of law, and that's typically how it's done. And they just point by point. But Trump did something very unusual, and he only gave 1 question, and it wasn't very specific. And what he said basically was that the Colorado Supreme Court err in ordering him excluded from the ballot? Right? Did they make an error? But that's not really a question of law, right? That's in some ways a question of fact. Because the real question of law could be, there's so many questions of law that he could have asked them to consider, or that could be asked of them, or that they might consider. So one of them is one of the things Trump was arguing was the 14th Amendment, Section 3 disqualification clause says it's an officer of the United States is who would be disqualified if you engage in an insurrection. Well, he has argued that he's not an officer. So that's one question they could determine it. Don't forget that in Colorado, the lower court held that Trump engaged in an insurrection, but they held that that the presidency is not an officer. I personally disagree with that. I think if you look at precedent and text and legislative history and constitutional history, it's pretty clear. And you look elsewhere in the Constitution, it's pretty clear that it does apply to the presidency, but Trump argues that it's not, but he didn't specify that. So we don't know if that's one of the things they're going to talk about. Another thing that Trump said is he didn't take an oath to support the Constitution, that the presidential oath is different. But of course he took an oath to support the Constitution. That's kind of a ridiculous argument, in my opinion. And so we don't know if that's going to be one of the issues they consider. Another one is, does the 14th Amendment Section 3, is it self-executing? That's a term or a phrase that we hear people refer to a lot. And what does that mean? That means, did Congress need to pass a law in order to make that valid, or is it self-executing in and of itself? In other words, is it a political question that requires an act of Congress? So the way I like to think about it is there are several things that disqualify presidents in the Constitution, like you have to be 35 years of age, you have to have lived continuously in the United States for 14 years, you have to be a natural-born citizen. Those are self-executing. You don't need Congress to pass a law to enforce that. If Trump were any of those things or not any of those things, then any Secretary of State in any state could take him off the ballot, right? In fact, all of them would and have to. There are other things that states very much can determine who can be on a ballot in a primary. So, for example, the Maine Secretary of State said she took Chris Christie, she denied his application to be on the ballot because he didn't get enough signatures on his petition, which is something you have to do to get on the ballot. So there's plenty of things they're allowed to do and are required to do. And the question is, why is the 14th Amendment Section 3 any different? Shouldn't it be self-executing like those other qualifications? And another question they could decide is it too difficult, what does it mean to engage in an insurrection? And one of the things George Conway said in this article was, look, if the courts can determine the meaning of, quote, equal protection under the laws, which is Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, then they should be able to also determine what Section 3 of the same amendment says and not require Congress to have to pass some law, because engaging in an insurrection or providing aid or comfort there too isn't that complicated of a concept, so it shouldn't be a problem. So that's going to be what it's unclear what the Supreme Court's going to decide, because they accepted Trump's petition of this very general question that is more a question of fact than it is a question of law. Whether or not he engaged in an insurrection, the court found that the lower court had a trial. It was a full trial, and they found that he did. And so we'll see what question they actually will listen to, or what they are thinking about. But today, what happened, and the reason I think it's a slight glean into what the Supreme Court is thinking, is they requested the record from the Supreme Court of Colorado. So they want to see the record. It's no surprise. Of course, they want to see the record. I mean, that's part of what they will do. But I think it's a good thing that they requested it now. And I think it also shows that they're not just looking at this whole case from a fresh perspective, anew, that they're going to look at the record, see what they decided, and hopefully accept the record, the facts, and not decide, again, did Trump engage in an insurrection, but accept that they found that he did, and then only decide what the law is. And that's what I think this means. But again, we'll see. This is all moving so quickly, much quicker than anything else in the Supreme Court would ever be. So hopefully they will also move the immunity case just as quickly, so that we can have a trial in Washington, D.C. I'm Karen Friedman-Agnifilo with Legal AF.
Feel any better? I have already put evac on alert. He's ready to go if it comes to that. General, I can assure you.
Hey, Chapo, let me into the war room to see you, so I had to hack my way onto this frequency.
This better be critical, Wheelie.
Sir, come on, what is it not, please? Okay, couple of things. I'm running low on the dough. I was thinking about taking a couple of months sick leave, maybe starting today. And, oh yeah, I intercepted a transmission from Megatron.
Then send it through.
Yes, sir, right away, sir. And so I'll assume that we're going on the other stuff.
This is your last warning, insects. Relinquish what remains of the Allspark.
So who is the insect? You? What?
The
Who's the
Autobots cannot
insect?
protect you. They were defeated on our
way.
world, and we will defeat them here.
This was just a diversion. Security, make bring up. Ravage, he's already inside. Deeds! Give me an update on that reserve. Boss readiness. What was his name? What was it?
Evac, sir.
Right, evac.
She's right in front.
We're facing a heavy sustained attack. They appear to be after the All-Star. General! General! Need this evac immediately, General. Evac everything. National security evacuation. Stand down. Check it out. The mission is outrageous. The amateurs are suicide mission.